guess we can get started.
Excellent.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Preservation Connecticut, talking about preservation. If you're not on mute, can you please mute yourself for a few minutes, and we'll open it up for conversation a little bit later in the program. So welcome to today's program, talking about preservation, Mohegan Tribal Preservation Program. And we're all really excited about this. Staff has been chattering back and forth how excited we are to have this program today. So who is Preservation Connecticut? We are the statewide historic preservation organization established in 1975 by special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. And we changed our name, or doing business as Preservation Connecticut, starting last January. So I'm the executive director, Jane Montanaro. Chris Wiegren, deputy director, is on the Zoom call. We have circuit riders, Brad Scheid, Stacy Vero, and Mike Farino. And Stacy is on the call with us, and I think Brad and Mike will join us as well. Also Renee Tribert, Jordan Sorensen, and Kristen Hopewood are staff members. So please reach out to Preservation Connecticut staff for any preservation questions that you have during this program or following. So we're doing these programs during these COVID times as a way to keep in touch with folks, continuing our mission and continuing to stay in contact with our constituents and members of the community. And our mission is to preserve, protect, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the vitality of Connecticut communities. It's all about supporting communities and preservation goals that the community supports. And this is one of our education programs. We are excited to bring to you a variety of topics and cover the broad spectrum of all of the issues that touch on historic preservation. And this is a nice informal lunchtime forum to be able to introduce you to all members of the preservation community, and also an opportunity to hear from you. So use the chat, contact us, raise your hand during conversation. This is what the program is about. It's to hear from you and any of your questions and comments and preservation issues. We are here to help. So we're really excited to have James Quinn here today, and very proud to say that he is also a member of our Board of Trustees. So welcome, James, and I'll let you tell everyone a little bit more about yourself and let you take it away. And I have control of the slideshow, so just tell me when to advance.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jane. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for being here. As Jane mentioned, I'm James Quinn. I'm the Mohegan Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Archaeology Program Manager. So they are kind of two distinct but similar programs. And so I'm going to, again, thank you for everyone being here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about both programs, kind of tell you how I got to where I am, and then hopefully we can have some questions and dialogue after that. So to start with how I got to where I am, I began my journey here as a part-time undergrad at the University of Connecticut. During my first semester, I received a tribal email promoting our Mohegan Archaeological Field School. And I thought, wow, what a great way to earn 6 credits and knock off half a semester. At that time, I really had no idea what archaeology really was, outside of course, the Indiana Jones movies and things like that. And so I took the course, and it really changed my perspective. At the time, I was considering a business path, and like most of my tribal cousins, going into our gaming and hospitality enterprise. But after spending a summer in the field and kind of hands-on learning about my history and the heritage of the tribe, and really changed my perspective. And so the following semester, got back to school, I declared my major in anthropology and took the field school again the following summer. And then for the consecutive summers after that, 3 summers after that, I interned for the Mohegan Archaeology program. And so upon graduating in 2006, the tribe hired me full-time as the archaeological field supervisor. And so here I am. So that's how kind of where I got to, and I've been with the tribe and ever since. So now you know a little bit about my path here. Today I figured I'd just tell you a little bit about both our programs, give you a brief overview, and then hopefully, like I said, we can have some conversation about it afterwards. So we'll start with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, which was established in 2011. It was established by a joint resolution by the Mohegan Tribal Council and the Mohegan Council of Elders. They passed a resolution naming me as the first THPO in the history of Mohegan, which I'm very honored to have been named. So the federal THPO program is overseen by the National Park Service, which provides grant funding to federally recognized tribes through the Historic Preservation Fund. The grant is non-competitive and tribes have to apply every single year. Our THPO program is jointly funded by the tribe and the grant because sadly, most tribes have to rely on that THPO grant, which barely covers operating costs. I mean, most tribes just use that to cover the salary for their one-person THPO staff, which is, you consider the workload is very overwhelming. So there's been a lot of lobbying by tribes over the years to increase that funding. And although it did increase this year, every year more THPOs come online. So the piece of the pie gets smaller every single year for tribes. States, SHPOs, there's 50 states, and that's not going to change. But with tribes, there are 560, I think, almost 560 federally recognized tribes. And not even quite half of us have THPOs at this point, but more and more every year are coming online. So like I said, that pie gets a little smaller every year. So hopefully we'll continue to grow that funding, but we'll see. So the Mohegan Archaeology program was actually established almost 25 years ago. The tribe has been doing its own archaeology ever since. Regulatory work, research archaeology, and as I mentioned briefly, the Mohegan Field School. So that program has really been a strong program for the tribe. And as I said, it's been a very popular program with the tribe as well. Small but popular. People really appreciate the work we do with the tribe. The tribe views both of these programs as active expressions of tribal sovereignty. For most of the history of this nation, as many of you know, tribes have had little to no say about what happened to what happens to the treatment of their ancestral homelands and their most important and sacred sites. And as many of you also know, is that many of these tribes have been removed permanently from these areas. Mohegan has been, gratefully has been able to remain in our homeland, although we too have lost a lot of sites through time. And so what we really strive to do and working and striving to do is preserve those sites. And we do this through a variety of ways, but mostly through advocating for our interests at the tribal, state, local, and federal levels. But we also advocate for all Native tribes because, as I was mentioning, when it comes to the federal government's responsibility to the tribes, usually when one thing happens to one tribe, it has a large ripple effect all across Indian country. So like I said, we're kind of all in it together when it comes to overall federal legislation, and tribes are pretty good about working together to hold the federal government to task, which is not always a very easy thing. Okay, we can go to slide 2 if you want. So these are just some of the few objectives that kind of a high overview of what we try to achieve. And so while we wear many hats, these are kind of what guide our actions. So we identify and inventory important Mohegan sites. We incorporate the Mohegan Tribal Historic Preservation Plan into the master planning process for Mohegan lands. The plan includes, among other things, the Mohegan Cultural Resource Protection Ordinance, the Council of Elders criteria for site evaluation, and the Tribal Register of Historic Places. So this plan is really, it establishes the need, it mandates cultural resource surveys for tribal projects, the criteria for site evaluation outlays, all the steps guidelines for studying and research in the field and archaeological research on Mohegan lands. And the Tribal Register, of course, is, I'm sure you're all familiar with the state register and the national register. Tribal register is a very similar concept, but obviously using the tribe's own criteria for evaluation and naming to the register. So we also have many programs to educate the tribal membership and public about the importance of preserving sacred, historic, and traditional Mohegan sites. We really strive to inform others about the history of Mohegan and how it really had and its many contributions to the founding of the country. The tribe was heavily involved, obviously, early in the colonial, and had a very big role in early colonial New England. So we think that's an important thing that people should really understand and know about. And we also, as I mentioned, provide guidance and advocate for protection of tribal cultural resources off tribal lands, but within our ancestral homelands by working with local, state, federal entities. Okay, we can go to the, if I speak too fast, let me know. I have a tendency to talk quickly. So we can go to this next slide. All right, so before we really get into it, here's some photos that kind of highlight some of the work we do. So at the top, moving from left to right, what you see there is the Mohegan Church. This was one of the last pieces of land the tribe held communally before, after the reservation. The original reservation was broken up. So it's obviously a very important historic structure, one of the few historic structures on our tribal register. But it's been so much more than just a church. It's been a place of continuity and a tribal community. Tribal council meetings have been held here over the years. Also, way back when, the wigwam, or what many know as a powwow, was held there in front of the church. So the church really was an anchor, and it's not just been a place of worship, and it's really been a community center, a seat of tribal government, and where tribal members have had a place to always come together. So that was a very important factor in our federal recognition as well. And so the next picture is a picture of some of our tribal youth. We host an annual Earth Day event, cleanup event, and we generally go to Fort Shantok. And so last few years, the kids seem to enjoy it, and it's been just a great way of getting kids on the land, getting them to understand the importance of taking care of our land. And so as you can see, we try to work in a little bit of our language as well. So the youth are really where we aim a lot of our educational programming at. As you can see in the next picture as well, this is a picture from a tribal youth campout at Mohegan Rock in Uncasville. We have a tribal elder, Chris Harris, drumming, singing, and kind of telling stories to the youth. This was a great event. It was, Mohegan Rock is what we consider a traditional cultural property for the tribe. And we will discuss that a little bit later as well. But this was for all those kids there, this was their first time visiting the Rock. And so we had a great time. We went out there, told stories, drummed, danced, sang. We had a gentleman come and talk about leave no trace. So, picking up your trash when you are respecting the land, not leaving anything behind. And then a cookout and just, campfire stories at night. And the kids just really enjoyed that. So that was a really great program. The bottom left, we have some tribal drummers and singers. They had just performed for our archaeological field school. So we incorporated a lot of those kind of traditions and things into our field school as well. And then we have a picture from a day of excavation at our field school at one of our domestic 19th century Mohegan homesteads. And then the bottom right is a picture of an important waterfall that's close to Shantok Village, which is obviously a very important site to Mohegan. Shantok is considered the first village of the Mohegan. So, and there's a lot of these little waterfalls and streams, and that the tribe holds very important. So, like I said, these are just kind of some photos of what we do, and kind of exploring, showing you what we do. And so we can move to the next slide. Okay, so start with take a closer look at the Mohegan Archaeology program. As I mentioned, it's been in operation for over 25 years now. We conduct academic-based field research, and as well as cultural resource surveys, kind of the regulatory end of things for tribal development, construction projects on tribal lands. The tribe considers tribal lands as all federal reservation and trust lands, as well as all fee lands, as well as all lands owned in fee simple by the tribe. So the Cultural Resource Preservation Ordinance and the plan apply to all tribal lands, even those not in federal trust or on reservation. So as I mentioned, we've done regulatory and academic-based research. I mentioned the field school briefly. And so what you have pictured here on the left, that is an excavation with our field school from a 19th century domestic Mohegan homestead. And on the right is just a kind of a map of a cultural resource survey project, archaeological survey project we did in 2009 for a proposed tribal project. And so we do about 2 or 3 of those a year, although the construction slowed down considerably in the last few years. But anything that goes on in terms of development, we have a say, and we go in and review most of those lands. So so we can go a little. We can move on. All right. So the field school is something we're really proud of. We've been running this field school for 20 plus years. What we believe it is one of the oldest Native American run field schools in the country. Not too many tribes have their own archaeology programs, much less an archaeological field school. And so we've had students from all over the world join us. It used to be a 6-week, 6-credit program, but it's since retooled, and we are now a 5-week, 8-credit program, which is a phenomenal opportunity. So if you think of anybody who's in school or just wants to come take an archaeological field school, I have to put in a plug for it, because I think it's just a great opportunity. You come to the reservation, you work amongst a diverse group of people. We try to get as many Native students as we can, but that's been a difficult task as well. But it's just a great opportunity for people. So our current research is that we've been focusing on 18th and 19th century Mohegan homesteads. It's helping us better understand how Mohegans and Native people in general were adapting to the realities of the post-colonial era. It was a very difficult time for tribal people and tribal communities trying to regain their footing in a quickly changing social and economic landscape. There were great pressures on tribal communities. A lot of the men were leaving to go whaling and trying to seek economic opportunities elsewhere. And so it's just a really dynamic and interesting time to study. And people tend to think that tribes are just generally interested in, the kind of what you want to call pre-contact archaeology or things like that. But there's a tribal historic archaeology is a really interesting field in of itself. So we've been focusing a lot of our work on these types of sites because instead of just focusing on how the narrative is usually about how tribes are changed by colonialism and how they're adapting and are they the same people? Are they the same? Instead of just focusing on that, we've been really focusing also on how tribes are maintaining continuity and traditions and values. And these domestic home sites have been a great way to really provide some of that information. We see it in the assemblages they leave behind. We see it in some of the way the houses are designed and the way they're, and community storage is still. So it's been really helping us understand how tribes, like I said, and particularly Mohegan, has been maintaining tribal community and continuity through time. So in addition to teaching our students about, archaeological methods and conducting field research, throughout the whole field school, we foster dialogue throughout the whole field school about the importance of including descendant communities and indigenous people in their research. Because for the most part, and I still go to conferences and I still see this, where people are presenting and they're writing their dissertations and they have not spoken to a single tribal person about the tribe they're researching. And that's still happening quite regularly. So what we're trying to do is instill in our students the importance of including these communities in your research and take in their perspective, because we don't feel like you're really going to you can only learn so much about things and artifacts and structures. So we're hoping that we're kind of creating a more inclusive and diverse field, but remains to be seen. But so far, we think we're doing pretty well. We run into our students at these conferences, and they'll walk out of a seminar going, "I can't believe they still do this kind of stuff." So we think we're doing pretty good. So we also bring in tribal academics throughout the field school, tribal traditionalists, spiritualists, and preservationists to speak, because we also want them to see that tribal people are engaged in these activities in these communities as well. So I think it's important, because you don't get to engage. In my experience, most of our students have not been able to engage with tribal academics and preservation professionals throughout. That really doesn't happen too often. We also discussed the beginnings of American archaeology, because American archaeology has some pretty horrific beginnings in terms of looting of burials and native sites. That's kind of how the field got started in this country. So we want to make sure that we expose all that and discuss all that, because it's important that they understand the beginnings of it and why it's important that they work to better the field. Because the work is amazing, but it just sometimes remains stuck in old modes of doing things. So we hope that we're making at least a somewhat little bit of an impact on changing the ethics and the way the field of archaeology conducts itself. So we can go to, I think, the next slide. And so again, these are just some photos from our various students. Actually, the upper left photo is quite interesting because for 2 summers, we worked with the University of Leicester in England. And these are actually English students that are here, and all of them their first time ever being in America. And we thought it was kind of an interesting thing that a Native American tribe is teaching English students how to do archaeology. We thought it was a very kind of unique flip of the script. And they really enjoyed it, and just, unfortunately, they had a hard time in the Connecticut summer heat and humidity. They were all kind of wilting, but because they were not used to it. But they really it really was and we also had 3 tribal Native American students that summer. So it was really a great mix of people, and just the dialogue that summer was just truly amazing. You know, once the kids finally get comfortable and start to you know, speak to each other, it's just you know, it's just, and that to us is important as the work itself. So like I said, that was a really unique experience. And so we just have some fun photos of students, and Jay on the total station here on the right, he works for us. He's my archaeological supervisor and just a great guy. He's been working with us for 20+ years. And on the bottom right, we have 2 tribal interns, and not Mohegan either, which is something we love as well, when we can get other non-Mohegan tribal members working with us. So that's Tone and Nikki on the bottom, which is fantastic. So like I said, we ideally would love to have a nice mix of tribal and non-tribal students to kind of foster that dialogue, but most summers it's hard to get tribal students in because the funding is just not there for them. But when we do get them, we're very appreciative of that. So we can go to the next slide. And again, just some more photos. This site, the Miller Fielding site, is a very interesting site. It burned, but what we're finding is that we uncovered thousands and thousands of carbonized corn kernels. We have carbonized beans, we have carbonized squash, and we have carbonized potato at this site. And the amount is kind of suggesting to us that this is a community storage, which may perhaps speak to the idea that tribes are maintaining continuity through community and things like that. So when we look at that and see things like that, it makes us stop and think that because not every house that we excavate, or and certainly not every historic homestead that is excavated has the amount of bean and corn. I mean, literally thousands and thousands of corn kernels and beans, which is just amazing. I mean, in terms of the amount. So really interesting stuff. And so we're trying to determine the nature of the fire, which is kind of hard to tease out, but we're looking at that. Like I said, there's 2 other homesteads within, you know, 200 yards one way and about 300 yards the other way. So what we think we have is kind of the remnants of a little Mohegan community on the original reservation, which is another interesting thing. So so we'd like to think we're kind of piecing together this Mohegan, we call it a little Mohegan village again. And so it's kind of really neat. Once we're able to look at everything, it's going to be really fascinating. So we have on the bottom left is actually the photo of the students from the University of Leicester, and it's on the very first day. So it's actually and so it's just some good-natured kids, and we love having every year. It's really a great, fantastic experience. We learn a lot from them too. So just like I said, we really highly value our field school, and we've been working with this. It's called the Institute for Field Research. It's kind of a clearinghouse for field schools. Most of the time, students are kind of confined to the field school that their university offers. But the IFR provides opportunities all over the globe. They help with advertising and promoting the field schools, which is fantastic. And you know, students sign up through them, and that's brought to us a much more diverse and crowd from all across the country, which has been just absolutely amazing. So when the first 10 years or so, strictly kind of students from the Northeast. A couple of years we had the Leicester kids, as I said, and now, but recently, the last 4 or 5 years, we've been really getting students from all over the country, which we really, really appreciate. So you can please move to the next slide. And so on top of teaching them archaeological methods, talking about archaeological theory, the history of archaeology, and all those things I mentioned before. We also bring in tribal people with traditional skills, and we introduced them to what we have on the top left is a tribal member, Justin Scott. And so we had a 2-day wampum making workshop with our field school, which is it was our first time 2 summers ago. We unfortunately had to cancel this past summer, of course, because of COVID. And the students just loved it, and they got to make something and bring it home with them, which is absolutely amazing. And so Justin's a very accomplished wampum maker, and obviously there were no saws like you see there in the past, but you know, the end product is the same. So it was a great workshop. Like I said, the kids just loved it. Got to take a piece home with them. You see some kind of unfinished wampum beads in the bottom left corner there. And into, you know, wampum also, and you see in the bottom right is a Shantok ware pottery production class that we had with our students. And so Elaine Thomas, who's been with the program longer than I have, the archaeology program, and who is our deputy THPO, she's a highly accomplished Shantok ware pottery maker. So this is a traditional pottery that originated from Shantok in Uncasville. And so, you know, what distinguishes it from most pottery of the time, or I don't know if you can see in the photos, but are what we call these castellations, kind of these pointed triangle, you know, around the rim. You see the kind of the 3 in the large one in the middle. You can see the kind of points on the rim of the, and so those castellations and are mainly what kind of distinguishes it from other pottery of the time. And we found so many examples of this from Shantok in our excavations there over the years. So another really great way of introducing them to Mohegan culture, history. We have drumming and singing, as I mentioned earlier. And so we really tried to involve the kids and kind of, not quite immersion, I would say, but really try to involve the kids in Mohegan history and culture. Let them know they're still a thriving community that still highly values traditional skills. And so they seem to really appreciate those kind of things. So we think that's a really unique thing that our field school offers, and helps with us with our dialogue about you know, inclusion and you know, bringing to light that Native communities still are holding on to these practices. So and like I said, the kids really seem to appreciate this kind of stuff. Even our kids. So we have docents every year, and even our kids really appreciate this. I mean, I appreciate it. I got to make something and bring it home. So you know, we all seem to love this kind of thing. So, okay, we can probably move on to the next one. So I told you a little bit about the archaeology program. Again, very similar programs, have similar similar aims and goals. And it's all the same staff. So it's not like we have a separate staff for archaeology and a separate staff for historic preservation. But there are 2 separate mandates, if you will. You know, tribal historic preservation, like I mentioned, was established in 2011. And it's been an uphill learning curve ever since. It's really something you have to really understand, have a footing in tribal law, environmental law, you know, sovereignty issues. And it's really a steep learning curve. And there are so many federal agencies out there, and I'll tell you a little bit about the work we do with them. But like I said, we do other things. You know, here's the flyer for our youth camp out, which is, like I said, just very popular. We keep getting emails about when we're going to do it again, when are we going to do it again. There's Jay Levy, like I mentioned, our field supervisor, talking about wampum and that's a wampum belt, and talking about the importance of wampum before it became currency. A form of currency. Wampum, if you're not familiar, had many other uses, ceremonial uses, sealing agreements, almost somewhat like a dowry for weddings. Like I said, wampum had many meanings before it was adopted as a form of currency in the colonial times. So that's Jay kind of explaining all of that. And so you know, and finding that a lot of our kids didn't even know that. You know, you generally associate wampum with money. So we've been, you know, we work on trying to dispel kind of those kind of things as well. And on the far right there, that's a picture of Shantok Village. That is the first village of the Mohegan people. It's one of the best preserved 17th century native fortifications in New England. We've learned so much from that. There's been a lot of excavation done over the years. Unfortunately, there was a lot of looting there in the 20s. There were a lot of collectors going around the 20s, going around the sites. Edward Rogers, Norris Bull, and a few others were, and at the behest really of institutions and museums that were paying these guys to go on and essentially loot these places. So unfortunately, we lost a lot through looting. But we've been able to regain a lot of that and get a lot of that stuff back over the years. But you know, and then in the late 60s, early 70s, Bert Solomon from New York University did a series of field schools at Shantok with no tribal involvement or input. So these are the kind of things we talk about when we see what we do now as an expression of sovereignty, because we are now controlling who, where, and when, you know, in terms of any digging on the land, any research at all. And so, you know, as a matter of protection, really. So we're starting to open up a little bit in terms of writing and publications, but for the most part, we've been kind of looking inward for the last 20 years or so, but we're starting to crack that door a little bit because now we've done our own research for so long, we're starting to get to a place where we can start producing our own history, well, you know, produce our own publications about Mohegan history and sites and things like that. So again, okay, we can move on. All right, so this slide just kind of show you a little bit about another large part of the work we do as a Tribal Historic Preservation Office. There's a virtual alphabet soup of federal agencies out there that we work with. These are just a few of the many that we work with. So if you're not familiar with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 requires federal agencies to consider the effects on historic properties of projects that they carry out, assist, fund, permit, license, or approve. So these are what we refer to as federal undertakings. So really, anytime a federal agency is involved in a project at any level, you know, they have to reach out to tribes that attach. They have to reach out to tribes, especially looking on tribal lands. So if a project's located on the reservation, Mohegan Reservation, or on our trust lands, they have to contact my office. THPOs essentially replace SHPOs on tribal lands. And tribal lands under the federal definition are reservation and trust lands. So SHPO really doesn't have any say on tribal lands. So we, like I said, essentially are the acting SHPO on tribal lands. And so we also have a say in projects off tribal lands, but within our ancestral homelands. So agencies also have to reach out to us on projects off tribal lands that we have an interest in, and to make sure that, you know, to ensure that there are no important tribal sites that are going to be impacted by the proposed project. Let's see. Let's see. So it's a little bit different off of tribal lands. The tribes don't have as much say, but it's certainly and it's a little more difficult process. But we find that what we've figured out is that building relationships with our federal reps at the regional level, working with the SHPO's office, which I'm grateful to say we have a fantastic relationship with, even going back to when I was first named THPO, going back to Dan Forrest when he was the SHPO. It really began there, and it's just really continued with Kathy. Kathy and I have developed a fantastic working relationship over the years, and we really appreciate. They may not always agree with us, but that, you know, but the point is that I can pick up the phone and call Kathy and many of the federal regional reps and have a dialogue, which is instead of, you know, through email and so impersonal. We found that relationship building is a really great way to build capacity and you know, make things a little bit easier for everybody. So some examples of projects we might consult on are an FCC regulated cell tower construction, highway improvements that are funded or partially funded by the FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, or housing developments funded or insured by the Housing and Urban Development. The sub-base calls me when they're going to do something on their land, the Navy, you know, and so the Coast Guard Academy, a little more recent. I've been consulting with the Coast Guard Academy on the proposed museum on London. Not sure it's ever going to happen, but so all those projects so I've been working with them. Army Corps we work with a lot because of wetland impacts. Army Corps, I would say, in my experience, is the most difficult agency to work with. but anyway, there's a lot to that, so I won't get into much into that. But every agency really has its own. One of the big issues is that every agency has its own 106 culture. There is no standard. There's guidelines and there's guidance from the federal government, from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, but every single federal agency handles it in a different way. And it's really, it takes a lot to learn the culture, the 106 culture of every agency. So that's something that really puts tribes behind the 8 ball, because they're expecting kind of somewhat of a uniform response. And unfortunately, that's just really not the way it works. And what we realized is, and again, it goes back to relationships, because we've realized that it's really the people at the regional level that, that you work with that make the difference. And so, that's the most important thing. But unfortunately, there's also a lot of turnover in federal agencies. So once you kind of, form this relationship, and next thing you know, they're gone. And then you step back to square one, and somebody will come in with a whole different idea of how 106 goes. So 106 is really a mixed bag, and it's by far a perfect statute, but at the very least, it does give tribes a say in what's going on. So it's what we have to work with. So we try to do our best with it. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Would you mind going back? I want to give you a little bit more. I'm sorry. My apologies. So I'll give you a little bit more about the process itself, the federal process. So the tribe, if in the course of a consultation, a site is identified and it's determined to be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, the agency, the project proponent, the state, if it's off tribal lands, and other interested parties have to work together to find a way to, in the official terminology, minimize, mitigate, or avoid impacts to that site. Most of the projects I work on involve archaeological sites, and those are seem to be the hardest to avoid for whatever reason, for many reasons, I guess I should say. So when it comes to mitigating, historic structures, sometimes you can tweak and get around them. But unfortunately, archaeological sites seem to be, in the minds of most agencies, something that you can kind of just take out of the ground, and that's how you mitigate impacts to it. Because the majority of eligible archaeological sites usually are mitigated through what's called a phase 3 data recovery, which is essentially excavating a percentage of the site to try to retain all the information and data that gives the site its eligibility. So, which is it's a flawed task, because you're leaving behind so much usually, and the mitigation is an adverse impact in itself. So, unfortunately, archaeological sites are usually go to phase 3 data recovery, and then they're gone forever, and they sit on the shelf. And generally, sometimes they have to produce educational materials on them, but for the most part, they kind of just go away and sit on a shelf. There are exceptions. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with what was going on in Avon. One of the oldest sites in Connecticut was found in Avon, and they did a phase 3 on that. And so that's going to be a really interesting. That's going to be really interesting once they finish that publication. And another way sometimes to mitigate impacts to an archaeological site is to cap it with large amounts of clean fill. But I generally tend to not think that's a great option as well, because I'm not really sure it preserves the site, and they say that it preserves it for potential future study. I'm not sure who's going to go in and remove 100 feet of fill and study the site, which is probably going to be compacted and no longer there anyway. So unfortunately, the options are never really very great. Avoidance would always be the best, but unfortunately, that just seems to be the exception, not the rule. So, okay, let's see. And so here's some examples of of the sites Mohegan might be interested in. So on the top left, we have the Tanaquidgeon Museum, which is a historic structure and actually the oldest native-run museum in the nation, built in 1931 by my great uncle and great aunt Gladys and Harold and Gladys Tanaquidgeon. It's a small 3-room museum, but it's a vernacular architecture, obviously. And it's a great little place. This is on top of Mohegan Hill. It's just a fantastic little museum if you haven't been there. Unfortunately, it's not open right now, but it's free admission. and it's like I said, over the years, it's evolved from a kind of pan-Indian cultures from all over represented from all over the nation. We have since switched to a more Eastern Woodland Mohegan focus. And for the first time ever, we actually have some of our archaeological collection in this museum, which is fantastic because now our membership can come and see it. And, because we have all this information sitting on our shelves, and we want to get it out because there's no reason to dig if you're not going to share the information. And so we're very happy to be working with the museum finally. So that would be an example of a historic structure that we might be interested in. Obviously, an archaeological site on the right there, that's actually excavations from Fort Shantok many years ago. And then on the bottom left is Mohegan Rock, which pictures never can really do it justice because the size of this thing is pretty immense. This is a freestanding boulder, and some say the largest freestanding boulder in Connecticut, left over from the retreat of the glaciers many years ago, obviously tens of thousands, 12,000, 13,000 years ago. And so at this place, this is what we would call a traditional cultural property. These are and this is a place where our first sachem Uncas is said to have held council atop the rock. So traditional cultural properties are generally places according to, I'll give you, actually, you can go to the next slide, I'm sorry. I'll give you the official definition of traditional cultural property. So, and these are kind of unique to most people who don't, maybe aren't working for a tribe or aren't familiar with. And although any community or culture, or if you will, or any community can claim traditional cultural properties, the language seems to have been written with tribes in mind. So according to the National Park Service, a traditional cultural property is a property that's eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places based on its associations with cultural practices, traditions, beliefs, lifeways, arts, crafts, or social institutions of a living community. And so generally, these are places that are significant despite being largely absent archaeological resources and many times lacking any significant historic structures. The importance of these tribes in a native context are generally defined by the oral history associated with them. And if you're not familiar with oral history and tradition, it's generally a tribe's way of passing down its history through their generations, through stories and through allegories and through things like that. And oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I could absolutely. And I would definitely share a link to the museum. Sorry. So the importance of these places, as I said, is generally passed down through generations. I learned about it from my grandma, Mohegan Rock from my grandmother. My grandma learned about it from her mother before her. And so these are places that have deep roots in the community. And we have plenty of these. So we'll talk a little bit about a consultation that involved traditional cultural property for us in a little while. But so this is one example. Mohegan Rock is one example of those places. And in consultation, these are the hardest places to argue for because there's a lack of hard scientific data. And the emphasis is always on Western knowledge and Western way of seeing the world and Western, and data and science and things like that, which is great. Believe me, I practice that with archaeology, and obviously science always has its place. But oral history and tradition, it deserves an equal seat at that table when it comes to consultation because, tribes have been holding this and passing this down. And this is how tribes tell their story. And that's always been kind of those are the hardest things to prove and argue for because, like I said, there's no artifacts and generally no historic structures. So what you're talking about is arguing for beliefs and things like that, which becomes a little more philosophic. So anyway, yeah. So now you have a little idea of what those are. We can talk a little bit about. I'd like to talk a little bit about the one consultation that I was involved in that involved a traditional cultural property. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm back up again. So I'm sorry. You can. Sorry, Jane. So other areas that we might consider TCPs, as they call them in short. So on the left is Indian pipe, which is a traditional plant used in medicines and tonics and things like that by the tribe for many years. So on top of documenting archaeological sites, historic sites, and in structures, we also document areas of traditional plants and medicines. And so we try to preserve those sites on a reservation, as much as we try to preserve an archaeological site or historic structure. Because we're trying to encourage these plants and medicines to come back and promote more traditional gatherings and things like that. So we survey and map these things in as we would any other site. So we've been starting to do that in the last few years especially. So that's a type of TCP, traditional gathering area. Again, Mohegan Rock, a little bit better in terms of dimensions there, you can see it. And on the right is the Indian Leap in the Antic area of Norwich. And so we have many, many stories associated with Indian Leap. And so that's a really highly important TCP for Mohegan as well. So these are just kind of some examples of TCPs. And I hope, you get a little bit of a better understanding. And like I said, the archaeology, we did extensive archaeology around the rock at Mohegan and found next to nothing, which to us speaks to its importance, because you wouldn't be making tools in a highly important place, in a place of ceremony, because not only was council held there, people still to this day hold ceremony there. So you wouldn't necessarily be making tools, leaving debris behind at a place where you do ceremony. And like I said, and the history associated with Indian Leap is just deep and rich, and so many stories associated with that. So, okay, we can, so there's some more examples of TCPs. So let's see. So this was one example of a consultation I'm involved in, actually my very first consultation as the THPO, turns out. And so what you see is some hand-drawn maps of Mohegan Hill, which is the kind of center and heartbeat of Mohegan universe. So there was a Section 106 consultation that my office was involved in. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was ensuring a 120 unit housing development that was proposed right next to, if you can see on the left, the writing's kind of small, but where it says Fort Hill, kind of right in that general area. And we engaged with HUD, and an archaeological survey was done. Next to the small lithic scatter of tool making was found, excuse me, but nothing significant. But we had provided comments that Mohegan Hill is in fact a traditional cultural property for the tribe, the whole of the hill, the landform itself. Because if you can see, there are so many different sites, at Fielding Homestead, Uncas Hill, Uncas Cabin Spring, if you can see those on the screen there. And so from the church and from the top of Mohegan Hill, there are paths that used to radiate out from the top of the hill and would connect. You could walk to all these sites from the top of the hill, so that they were all connected. You could get to them. And on the Fort Hill side over there, on Fort Hill, it's named Fort Hill because at one time, and remains today, parts of it, there's remains of a stone fort that we call Uncas Fort. And this was a fort that Uncas would send his family in time. It was a place of refuge when we would be kind of under threat from the Narragansett or from something else. Uncas would send his family to this Uncas Fort. And so this was on the property that was proposed for development. There were many stone features that the tribe traditionally values as a ceremonial stories associated with what we call the little people. So they're very highly important to the tribe in tradition, and so in all these other sites that are connected to it. So the whole of the hills is what we consider a traditional cultural property, the landform itself, because of all the importance of the stories and the sites associated with it. And so we argued that this was a TCP, and HUD was having a little trouble with that. The state, SHPO at the time, Dan Forrest, hired a CRM firm to come in and assess our claims of a TCP. And so AHS came in and studied our claims and did an extensive study, research on it, and concurred with our claims. The state then agreed, and HUD agreed as well, and they determined Mohegan Hill to be a traditional cultural property of the tribe and eligible for the National Register. And it's a very rare thing to have a site declared a TCP and based on essentially oral tradition and things, largely on oral tradition. So, it was a contentious consultation, and the advisory council had to get involved and mediate and come down, and we're finally able to work with the proponent, the state, and ACHP and HUD, and come to an agreement to move forward. The Uncas Fort would have been turned into a state archaeological preserve. There were some other mitigating factors involved. and we had an agreement all signed, but we don't know what happened. It just never moved forward after that. And that's almost 10 years ago now. But that's just an example of a consultation I did with involving a traditional cultural property, and those are, like I said, more rare than working with sites, archaeological sites, or structures or things like that. So I know Stacy mentioned TCP, so I just wanted to kind of give you some background on, and hopefully give you a little bit better understanding what those are. Okay, we can go to the next. And so this is just a map. If you see the red, that's the boundary line that the state and HUD and ACHP agreed on for the, we actually thought it was bigger. We argued for a bigger TCP boundary. But this is what we ended up with, which is fine. And that doesn't really, and it doesn't really prevent development. It just makes, 106 is just a hard look statute. There's no real enforcement of stopping a project. So it just makes proponents and agencies take a harder look at what they're doing and within those boundaries now. So yeah, that's, and there's many other sites associated with this hill other than the ones you're seeing in kind of the bubbles there. So that, like I said, that was a really significant victory, I guess you would say, for the tribe in terms of consultation. Forgive me, my cat is meowing. Like I said, that was an interesting, really interesting, my first consultation, and boy, I would have really learned a lot in that one. So we can go to the next slide. And so kind of just want to bring it to a close with some of the most gratifying work we do, and that's working with our youth. You'll see them here dancing and singing on the left. We have a docent program where we try to get 3 or 4 of our tribal youth every summer to work with us, which can be challenging with this generation. Getting them outside every day and on the land, but once we see that light go on in their eye, and just they really makes us happy and hopeful for the future. And there's some of the kids from the camp out on the right there on the top, just friends for life. They'll remember that for life. They've never been camping, they've never been to Mohegan Rock, and now they can, they'll have that memory for life. And then you see some of our tribal kids on the left doing some archaeology with us, and then our campground on the bottom right. And like I said, that's really some of the most gratifying work. It gives a lot of hope for the future, because obviously our youth are the future, and getting these kids to understand the importance of preservation and preserving these places for their kids and grandkids is really something we're hoping they take to heart. So I think there may be one more slide. I'm not sure. Yeah, just some more photos. It's another photo from the camp out. Our tribal elder, Chris Harris, singing some songs with them. That's one of our kids, DJ, working the flotation tank in our archaeology lab, and some of the kids on our Earth Day cleanup. So like I said, there's some of the most gratifying work we do is with these kids. So I think that might be it. That might be all I have. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, James. That was a fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
And I know we have a lot of folks on the call who may have some questions.
Absolutely.
Charlie, I see your hand.
First, James, thank you.
Yes.
This is so fascinating to me. I'm on the post-Revolutionary War colonial side of this.
Okay.
I've grown up in Vermont and encountered the Abenakis, and I'm former chair of when it was called the Connecticut Trust. In 2019 with the state THPO office, I met when I was in Washington for Preservation Week. I met the woman who was in charge of the tribal historic preservation officers. And I have to tell you, I'm just fascinated by all of this. Mm-hmm. But the irony is the period that I like best is post-glacial, yes, through the Dutch to pre-revolutionary. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because it was during that period of time that I think the tribes were, how do I say it? They lived on the uplands in the winter, and they came to the shore, mm-hmm, in the summer. They had an incredible ecological relationship with the land, and it strikes me that there must be many TCP areas, they may not rise to that level, along our
Mhm.
Connecticut coast that we're not even aware of, estuaries, bays, low-lying areas that were part of this incredible ecological relationship to the
Mhm.
land. And when I think about the heritage of the tribe and your tribe, particularly as you come down the western side of the Thames, where, you know, basically those forts were all attacked and
Mhm.
destroyed, pre-revolution, in English. There's an incredible story here to be told, and also incredible linkages. So here's my very short question after
Sure.
way too much. Um, have you ever thought of exploring the coastal linkages outside of your tribal areas, vis-a-vis the growing interest in preserving the coastal resources from sea level rise as to your artifacts, or
Mhm.
addressing it from the point of view of growing aquaculture in Long Island Sound, which is directly related?
Thank you. I appreciate that. What I will say is that we've been working with the Connecticut Blue Plan. If you're familiar with that,
Yes.
so we've been somewhat involved in that. And through various consultations through the years, we've been working along the coast, especially in terms of when Hurricane Sandy came through. So we do have a very much vested interest in the coastline. We ourselves would go out to sea whaling and things like that. So
That's right.
yeah. So for the most part, we where we can, we certainly get engaged. We've worked with FEMA over the years, obviously. Like I said, the Blue Plan, which is kind of a work in motion. And it seems a little bit stalled at the moment, but I'm not sure. So for the most, that's how we generally engage. You know, unfortunately, there are no more tribal communities really along the coast, especially along as you go southwest. There's some remnants of the folks down there, but there are no real tribal groups remaining down in those areas to really carry that fight forward. So we get involved where and when we can. Unfortunately, we've got a lot coming at us in our own region, and like I said, for the most part, the Blue Plan has been our heaviest engagement, I would say. And other projects like consultation projects like the museum, the Coast Guard Museum, and things like that. So we engage when we can. We've been very engaged also in the windshore, the wind projects. Yep. So we've consulted on quite a few of those, Vineyard Wind and a few other ones that are proposed. And so now they're proposing what I believe also some potentially for Long Island Sound. So we're going to probably be engaged more heavily in those talks.
Which just brings me to my very last point, and that is someone like Preservation Connecticut, by picking up at least the awareness of how the tribes use the coastline, concurrent with the questions about what's happening to our coastal resources that are going to be submerged, could really step up and foster some awareness, because I think there's a tremendous synergy of interests that exists right now.
Sure. So kind of related to that, we've gotten kayaks and we go out in the Thames and we go up and down the coast just to get that different perspective from the water view, go on to Long Island Sound a little bit. So we're starting to do that kind of thing as well, just to get a better understanding of erosion and things like that as well. So
I'm going to reach back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. I was checking to see if Aaron was still on the call. He had put a question in the chat.
He left.
He left. All right. So, Rob Buchanan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I'm holding with one hand a very shaky webcam. So I'm
It's okay.
somewhat off center in more ways than one. So what is the current attitude with the SHPOs as far as cultural stone landscapes, cans, effigies, boulders, unusual stone walls, things like that? What is the current attitude there?
I will say that Kathy is always willing to listen and very open-minded. It's been, since my experience, going back to Dan before, the SHPO's office has always been willing to work with us. Not so much at times the state archaeologist's office at times in the past and now, and certainly in neighboring states, Massachusetts particularly, and Rhode Island are not so great to work with when it comes to ceremonial stone features and landscapes.
Right.
It's a great question because that's been a hotbed topic in the last 10 years or so.
Certainly.
Yeah, since it's really started to come to, and so we've been documenting out on landscapes, and we go out and map these places, and those are also hard to prove. Because, like mentioning, although there are physical elements to like the stone features themselves, the hard scientific data related to it is sometimes not there. So what we've been doing is we've been working with astrologists, actually, astronomists and astronomists, geologists and things like that, to try to kind of bring that perspective to it. Because, but those are harder to work with sometimes because they're vast as well. They can stretch for very far across the landscape.
Right.
So those are some of the most difficult consultations as well. And those are essentially TCPs as well.
Right. Do you work with other tribes to see what they're doing on that? Because I know Doug Harris has done a lot of work with.
Yes, we've worked extensively with the Narragansett, the Gay-headed Quinn of Wampanoag, the Mashpee, and the Mashantucket. So especially Narragansett and Mashantucket and Gayhead the last 10 years or so. We've really formed almost a coalition, if you will, we all kind of share the New England region, if you will, in terms of consultation these days.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It's good to hear that is progressing, because I know particularly with the construction of pipelines, that has been a big challenge to these important features.
And those are some of the bigger projects that we worked on that entailed working with the stone landscapes and power lines and things like that as well. So yeah, that's been a real interesting topic and heated debate for the last 10 years in New England.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Alexander, you have a question?
Yes, how you doing?
Hey, good.
THPO. First off, I just want to comment on your youth programs. I grew up in the Hudson Valley, New York, the Poughkeepsie area, and I participated in a program system, not as elaborate as that, but it was hugely impactful in my development growing up. It was a fantastic experience, and I take that lens wherever I go.
Absolutely. Fantastic.
Great. I'm really happy to see something as extensive as the program you got. That's great. But the question I have is, I've recently onboarded to FEMA as a historic preservation specialist in Section 106. I've done plenty of work privately in 106 in structures for federal properties. And I haven't worked with a tribal organization yet. Certainly could be on the gamut, something I'm going to run into. What are certain things that, coming from a THPO, aware of when approaching a tribe in a disaster situation?
So really with any consultation, I will give you this, and this is kind of the general rule: be prepared to get a history of their relationship with the federal government, prepared to sit and listen, because they're going to tell you their story and how, and because they want you to know, and so you're going to have to take some time. It's going to be kind of a feeling out process, but part of that is really just listening, and sometimes people roll their eyes, they go, here we go, history lesson, but it's important to walk into that situation with the ears first, really, and then, and kind of let them kind of dictate how things are going to go, and so you'll generally find that most tribal representatives are just like you, just trying to do their jobs. And, I think if you approach it in a respectful fashion, sometimes you can inquire about correct ways, like do you come with an offering? Some tribes have different protocols. And so some tribes, maybe they'll appreciate you bringing some kind of gift to the it doesn't have to be large, elegant kind of thing. But when you show up at a tribal consultation, understanding some of their values and traditions already, it usually has a good way of setting your consultation off in the right direction. So and just being respectful, and like I said, listening is a big part of being from what I see, listening as a federal representative is a big part of it. Not so much speaking, but listening for sure.
Gotcha. 'Cause I know before pen goes to paper, a lot of mitigation can happen before then, and it's
Absolutely.
sometimes
Absolutely.
it gets
It's all about
caught.
relationship building. It really is, and that's how we approach consultation. With and so you'll find that most tribes are willing to engage in relationship building as well. And actually, that instead of just kind of the cold hard, this is consultation X Y Z. So there's got to be a relationship built up around that. It's my at least that's how we approach it anyway.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alexander. Great question. We're a little bit over time, but I don't want to turn the conversation off just yet. Does anyone else have a question, Scott?
Scott Spiel. Yeah, I'm mute.
Oh, now you're on mute.
I'm not sure.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I'm muted, aren't I?
Just
Sorry
Spiel,
about
how you
that.
doing?
All right, how's it going, James? Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Anyway, Scott Spiel from State DOT here. I was wondering, well, one comment or question about the stone landscapes and archaeological verification of such things. Have you ever tried or experimented with soil chemistry, for instance, around those things, such as phosphate testing?
We kind of for age. You mean for trying to figure out maybe an age of them, and is that what you're talking?
No, for human use, because of course
human use.
Innovation, especially for instance, ceremonies like burning tobacco or something are likely to leave.
Yeah, that's a good point. No, we have not. Generally, that request would be something that most agencies probably wouldn't acknowledge. I mean, because it seems to be, especially I don't know, it's not something that we've. It's a good recommendation. It's not something we've tried. I think I vaguely heard of that but it might be a good idea. It seems that most agencies and firms are hesitant to go outside of any kind of traditional ways of approaching sites, and so is that an expensive process?
I'm sorry?
Is it an expensive process? Do you know?
No, not at all. It's very cheap. It was very common, for instance, several decades ago. And it's not expensive. You simply take a soil core and you can
send it off.
Perform it in the field. You dump, take a soil sample and you dump a certain liquid chemical upon it. It turns blue. It depends on how blue the paper gets. It doesn't tell you a whole lot, but for instance, if you want to say, okay, this is just a rock sitting out here, or this is a rock that has been going on around it for a long period of time, it might be useful.
Sorry.
And it's, as far as agencies willing to do it, I suppose it depends on which agency you're dealing with and how much they're willing to listen to their archaeologists. Some
always depends on that.
Don't listen very closely, but it could be interesting, for instance, both for the tribes, I think, and for archaeology as well, as having, for instance, some kind of method to assess.
And that's how I was kind of getting at with trying to build up some of the astronomy and other geology and things like that around and bring some science to it, because although we don't feel we need to, we shouldn't have to, agencies listen when you have that kind of information.
Right. Well, there's also stuff away from your homelands where, the Mohegan itself might not know whether they're used historically in this way or that way.
Absolutely.
I want to know. Right. So you don't have the oral history and things like that.
Well, I'll say lastly, a lot of the things we see out in the field are so elaborate and we're like this, you just know that this thing has been here for a long time and it's pretty historic. I try to preserve a stone wall on a reservation as much as I try to preserve a native site. You know what I mean? So stone walls I see it more as a shared heritage. It's all our shared heritage, in a way. So I advocate for colonial structures and stone walls as much as I do for native sites. So.
Right. Yeah, that's great.
It's all also, kind of all preservation to me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They're interesting for many ways, even just for the aesthetic and general preservation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
People like the stone stuff out there, and it's getting into the natural landscape as well. Do we really want to destroy the beautiful natural features out there?
Exactly. It's all tied together. It's not, the natural landscape's the site itself. So it's the way we kind of approach it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, on a kind of unrelated question, what do you guys think these days in terms of 106 compliance, and all the compliance processes of how programmatic agreements, for instance, are going, and the small stuff what level of effort's necessary, for instance, on, you know, some of the exemptions that the Department of Transportation uses, and what level of stuff that you guys want to see and what's just not worth your time?
Well, it's been a real difficult because I would say the gutting of the regulatory environment has been fast paced, and exemptions are being thrown at us from every single agency. Every agency is revamping. They've been ordered to revamp their process. And so now we're dealing with Twilight Tower, Cell Tower. Like, it's just, there's so many different things coming at us in terms of this administration, in terms of changing and how agencies approach their consultations. So we're looking actually to now, especially to work with agencies more and crafting PAs that'll be long-term, because we're finding out that the landscape is shifting so quickly. So we're working with a couple agencies now on programmatics. We only have one that's within RCS right now. So we're working on a few other ones because of that very problem. Try to get something in stone, set in writing for at least a 5-year period or so, because like I said, we've experienced, and I've experienced it at the regional level, attitudes have changed in certain agencies. They're not as responsive as they used to be, and that's just a product of where we are, I think. And unfortunately, this whole streamlining thing has always been a word we always cringe at, and it seems like that's really, really ramped up. So it's been a real struggle for us, I will say. Yeah.
What about, say, minimum thresholds of projects, like, for instance, traffic signals and stuff like that?
Yeah,
Are you amenable to getting rid of those, or do you still want to see them? Because obviously, to some extent, they still involve.
I see where you're going with this.
Well, it's just.
No, you know what, it is. And streamlining in some ways can be very good. Like I said, so for example, on the reservation, I don't need to see when they're putting in a street light or changing a traffic stop, or, you know what I mean? So I generally don't have any problems with those kind of projects. So that's something we can certainly work on if you want to pursue that a little further at some point. So yeah, like I said, I don't need to see every striping that comes across, every road striping,
Right. Well, we've already got exemptions for those. But I'm talking about
Yeah.
slightly more. For instance, like where the actual light traffic signal equipment is being replaced, and there might be some
exactly. Yeah, I mean, and it also depends on obviously the soils and and everything else that goes along with all that. So for the most part, though, traffic signals in the physical, unless it's in a newly undisturbed area, we're usually pretty good with that kind of stuff.
Great. I appreciate your input, and thanks for talking to us. I enjoyed it all.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Tom Taylor has been waiting patiently in the chat with the question. Tom, go ahead. Tom, can you unmute yourself?
Yep.
Oh, there you are.
Oh.
Nope. Try again.
Okay, got it.
There you are.
Yeah, I hope this isn't something that I missed in the conversation. I ironically was just teaching a class on land use, and I missed the start of this. But we were talking specifically with students, myself as an Indigenous person, and then speaking with students, a number of whom are from Africa, about issues of matriarchy and patriarchy relative to environmental attitudes and land ownership. And I'm hearing this discussion, and I'm wondering to what extent all of this is a battle of sort of like colonial and indigenous interests, and how they inform how we think of preservation. Like, as I understand preservation, in my education in preservation was very much like old white men observing exotic culture and creating narratives. And I look at a lot of the questions you're describing, and the problem of the BIA, and the idea that like we don't own our lands; they're held in trust for us, and we have to make arguments for oral tradition where the absence of a written language is seen as a cultural deficit. in that, like, if indeed as Indigenous people we at very least owned our tribal lands and had total control, would a lot of these conversations go away?
That's a really interesting question. First, I'm just kind of address the trust versus kind of owned and fee simple. The only danger, and I fully respect and understand what you're saying, that we don't own our lands. What I've seen through time, though, is because tribes are on these kind of middle of nowhere with no real hope of developing some of these lands. You know, when they did the Allotment Act, tribes lost millions and millions of acres. So there's a kind of a double-edged sword to tribes owning land versus having the federal government keep them in trust and you know, reservation status. But you're right. The idea that even on the reservation, we would have to make an argument for traditional cultural property if a consultation went in that direction. And it is the old kind of colonial Western way of thinking versus native thinking. That's kind of what we've been talking about, I guess, with the stone landscapes and, you know, like you said, trying to prove the significance of site based on oral tradition, because agencies tend to really want that hard scientific data, like you said, that written word. And, you know, when you're sitting there telling them, well, this is a story that was told to my great grandmother, you know, 3,000 years ago, and they're saying, what, you know, how is that even possible? Well, it is possible, but, you know, the problem is it just does not get the respect it deserves. You know, so it is definitely a real problem. And like I said, you know, I always struggle with the idea of a trust land and reservation versus tribes owning the land, because I do worry that if you ever go back to tribes owning the land, we're just going to lose it all eventually.
Right, and that's that's evidenced right now in the Canadian system, where there are some tribal elders that support the Trans-Canadian pipeline, and others that don't, and
yes,
some which are pro-development and some are traditionalists, and ultimately the government intercedes anyway and says, okay, you can't agree, so we're going to do the thing that serves the economic objectives.
Yes, and the other important and what's another good thing about having land in federal status is that the overarching federal statutes all apply to that land. Once you go to private property, those no longer apply. So what you'll have is maybe, you know, a patchwork of people saying yes to a project, the other one saying no, but it just makes you know, development much easier if it doesn't have those federal statutes, as you're well aware, I'm sure, you know. So.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. So I think that's unfortunately, at least in my education and in my experience, has been a lack of dialogue about what is the perspective of preservation, and does it, to the extent that we have to look to the federal government, can it solidify Indigenous people as a living culture, or like is there a danger of it playing into this idea that the American Indian is dead, and that cultural sites are memorials to an extinct culture?
Right. I mean, well, they've been writing us out of existence for the last 150 years, 200 years. So, you know, the paper has been bad as the sword, as they say. And
so, just really quickly to reply to the earlier question that someone had asked about coastal areas, I know in my experience, both in terms of land use and as an architect on the coast in Connecticut, you know, I was just working at the site of Sachem's Head. I've worked on the edge of the Mason's Island property.
Okay.
That's been so contested is that the land value of private property on the coast in Connecticut, it is so valuable, and on a regular basis, there's so much litigation involved in in coastal concerns, that the idea that, for example, the Mashantucket Pequots or the Mohegans have a cultural space that people look at as being taken from them because it was a traditional fishing ground, for example, is inconceivable. And really, that lack of coastal space, and the Narragansetts are the same way.
Absolutely.
But we're all consolidated north of Route 1 and north of Route 95. And that's simple economics. I mean, there was a Narragansett settlement still in the heart of Watch Hill until the middle of the 20th century, until taxation forced those people out of out of their homes. So I think bottom line, that has to do with the problem of private property and land value.
Oh, without a doubt, without a doubt. You know, they usually, like you said, consolidate tribes on a kind of unproductive land in terms of economics, if you will, until they find gas or until they find oil deposits or until they find, and then that land they get moved around again. So that's always history, right? Yeah. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we're really over our time. Thank you for sharing your time with us, James.
No, that's fine. This is great. Like I said, I don't mean to keep everybody, but it was fantastic.
Yeah, and certainly if you have more questions or you think of things later, contact us, contact James. That's what we're here for, to keep the conversation going. And I really want to...
I'm really easy to get a hold of. It's just J. Quinn at Mohegan Mill.
And thank you all so much for joining us. Next week, we're going to be talking with Aaron Fink, who runs the Historic Homeowners Tax Credit Program at the State Historic Preservation Office. So this is a great tool for those that are private homeowners to have some assistance with stewardship of their properties. And that's next week here at noon. And then I also wanted to give a quick plug for one of our partner organizations, Connecticut Preservation Action. They're having a Zoom event next Tuesday at 4 o'clock, where they're not celebrating 40 years as the statewide historic preservation advocacy group, and they're going to honor the founders of the organization, Helen Higgins, a former ED of Preservation Connecticut, and Jack Shanahan, a former SHPO. And the keynote speaker, I think will be interesting to most of you on the call, is from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Jim Lindberg. He's going to talk about the resiliency of older neighborhoods, especially in this, pandemic time. So being able to speak about how our historic neighborhoods are where traditionally the resiliency of our communities has lied. So we're really looking forward to hearing what he has to say about that. So as usual, there's lots of Zoom opportunities for you to stay engaged and learn more. And it's always wonderful to see you all. And thank you for all joining us today. We will send out the PDF to everyone that registered. There is a recording of it available. And contact us again with any questions. And also, please become a member so we can continue to offer these programs. We rely on the support of our members to continue to serve the communities of Connecticut. So thank you again so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks, James.
Thank you. Bye.